A queen sacrifice, a brilliantly executed positional plan. Just another day at the office for Alireza Firouzja in this Title Tuesday game. His opponent is Bugar Rasulov, a grandmaster. The ratings you see are their chess.com ratings. Let's jump right into this exciting and really well executed game from Alireza. Knight f3, knight f6. Alireza has black. C4, G6, G3, Bishop G7, Bishop G2, castles, castles, and D6. So White has played the English opening, at least it's the English so far, and Firouzja has played a King's Indian structure to this point. Knight to C3, Knight B to D7. Now, White could at this point, if they wanted to, play D4 and turn it into a regular mainline King's Indian by controlling these key central squares. But instead, he plays D3, which means it's his intention to stay in English structures. And you can see from this structure, these pawns are pointing towards the queen's side. This bishop at G2 is aiming towards the queen's side. So his basic strategy usually revolves around queen's side play, maybe rook to B1 and advancing this pawn up to create weaknesses. C6 is played by Firouzja. Basically, he wants to play D5 and counter in the center as quickly as possible. Also, it limits the scope of the bishop at G2. Rook to B1, preparing to advance the B pawn to B5 and try to create a weakness on C6. Firouzja plays A5, a very standard idea, basically to stop that move. He says, well, I'm going to play it anyway. E5, advancing in the center. Now B4, AB4, AB4. So White has gotten his queenside space, but Firouzja, by playing A5, has given his rook an open A file. So that's a little feather in his cap. And now he begins to play in the center of the board. He plays D5, and now he has a full pawn center. Basically, if he can keep that center intact, he'll be in good shape. But White wants to put as much pressure on that center as possible. A move like queen to B3, putting pressure on D5 is a decent approach. But in this case, Rasulov plays B5, trying to basically eliminate all of these pawns that would defend the D5 pawn so he can attack it more directly. Firouzja responds to that, however, with this move, D4, grabbing space with tempo by hitting the knight on C3. And it's a good move. The only downside to it, though, is it does clear the way for this bishop. The bishop is now unimpeded. That's the downside, but the upside is the gain of the tempo and the space. Pawn takes. He has to retake the pawn because his own knight on D7 is threatened. Now the knight at C3 has to move, and the knight goes to A4, trying to keep some control probably over the C5 square. Now rook to E8. And this Benoni structure, essentially it's a Benoni structure, Black's main play comes from the E5, E4 advance. If the colors were reversed, White would be playing for E4, E5. So he wants to break with this pawn move. Now here, Grandmaster Rasulov plays bishop to G5. This is a novelty. And Firouzja responds by playing queen to A5, a strong idea. He steps out of the pin from the bishop at G5 and attacks the knight on A4, threatening to capture it. So rook to A1 to defend that knight. And now Firouzja plays the strong and thematic idea E4, attempting to create weaknesses. If he takes here, then the C4 pawn is weak, and he wants to basically attack the pawn at E2. First, White plays bishop to D2, attacking the queen at A5. And normally you would think, well, the queen moves, and then we deal with this clash in the center of the board. But Firouzja looks at the position and comes to the conclusion that he can give up his queen. Now, it may not be an actual sacrifice because he gets sufficient material for the queen, but it is a creative decision over the board, to be sure. So what he does is he takes the knight at F3. He could play queen to H5, that's fine. But he takes the knight at F3, bishop takes queen, and now F takes G2. And since this pawn is attacking the rook at F1, White has to deal with that, and then Firouzja will have time to take a third minor piece, the bishop at A5. So rook to E1, is played first, and now rook takes A5. So Black has 3 minor pieces in exchange for the queen, a sufficient material exchange, but he also has the bishop pair. And in a position like this with lots of pawns, in the middle game, the minor pieces are probably more valuable here, I would think. Queen to d2 hits the rook at a5. Now the rook moves to e5. The rooks double up on the half-open e-file, attacking what is the weakest square in white's position, this e2 square, weak because this pawn at d4 makes it hard to advance. Rook a to b1, moving to an open file. Now knight to f8. This may look like a passive move, but this move is not about the knight at all. It's about the bishop on this square, threatening to come to h3 and keep this g2 pawn defended. Now, there's no way white can allow that, so he retakes on g2. A strong idea for black would be to play h5, h4, but he goes ahead and just develops that bishop to g4. f3 hits the bishop, and he's creating a barrier on light squares. The problem is he has this big weakness on the dark square at e3. The bishop goes to f5, h3, perhaps hoping to advance to g4 to kick the bishop away permanently. But now black, Firouzja plays g5 first. The idea is he'll just tuck that bishop back at g6 and keep it on the key diagonal. White does not want to take that pawn because of bishop takes h3 check. And then when the king takes, the queen would be lost. So instead, he plays the knight back to b2. This knight wants to get into a defensive position. It was on the side of the board, away from the action. Play to d1, maybe to f2 to give his king some defense. Knight goes to e6, aiming at the c5 square. The knight goes to d1. Now h5, continuing to expand on the king's side, attacking the weakened king at g2. Knight to f2, and now h4, coming in on those kingside dark squares and saying that white can go ahead and play g4. He would be fine in that case. Black would be, because then Firouzja would play knight to f4 with check. After king to f1, bishop g6, this position is totally lost. Black is completely winning here with this beautiful knight and threats all over the board, h3, e2, etc., etc. So instead, Grandmaster Rasulov plays knight to e4, tries to use a piece to keep this pawn defended, but obviously the piece can be captured. Hg3 was played first. Now here, king g3 looks like a move, but after bishop e4, de4, Firouzja would have this powerful strike. Rook takes e4. And the reason that's doable is because if he were to take the rook, then knight to e4 check would fork the king and queen. So instead, he goes ahead and plays the king to g1, maybe trying to use the pawn as a shield of his own king. But bishop takes knight, de4, and now knight to h5, defends this pawn on g3. And if he can get this knight to f4, this pawn along with the knight on f4 will create a complete barrier at f2, g2, and h2, cause all kinds of problems for white. Rook to b6, aiming at c6. The rook goes to c5, defending c6 and attacking c4. Queen to b4 hits the rook, although the rook is defended by the knight at e6 right now. Knight h to f4, and Firouzja gets the construction he was looking for with this pawn at g3 and knight at f4, again controlling these key 3 squares, and the king really is suffocating. The rook goes to b8, trying to exchange off some pieces. Firouzja says, okay, rook b8, queen takes b8 check, king to h7. Queen to e8, threatening to take the pawn on f7, but the question is that really much of a threat at all? Firouzja just goes ahead and plays king to g6, which covers that f7 pawn. Rook to b1 with the idea of rook to b7, queen takes f7 check. The problem is that doesn't really work. Black just plays rook takes c4, and in this position of rook to b7, Firouzja would play rook to c1 checkmate. Remember, all these squares are covered, so it's basically like a back rank mate in this position. So he cannot play rook to b7. He plays h4, sort of a attempt to lash out towards the end of the game. But after gh4, white resigned. There are just too many threats. The rook is coming to c2, and after d3, it would open up the second rank, and these pawns would march, and that would be it. And this rook at b1 can't move up because of the constant threat of a back rank mate. A really beautiful queen sort of sacrifice and a well-executed positional game from Alireza Firouzja. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.